Hello. Hello, hello, hello. Would you please go to your seats and transition naturally from lively crowds to quiet crowds? That was very well done. Thank you. Yeah, we're getting to the final talk of the day. And after that, we'll have the round table here, except there's no table and it's not round. So it's a panel. And there will be a bit of a transition time between the end of this talk and that. We'll do questions. We'll have a bit of movement here. We have drinks over there. Adele, do we recommend people to get a drink now, or do we do it later? See, that's good to know, right? Because I was tempted, but I've been blocked in by chairs here. So without further ado, three superheroes. They're going to do a talk, an amazing talk, and I'm very much looking forward to it. So if you could please give a very big hand to Andrew, Agatha, and Leo.
Hi everyone, I'm Andy. I'm the audio director at Rocksteady, somehow. And I'm here with two of our advanced sound designers, Leo and Agatha.
Hello, hello.
Today we're going to talk about the sound of Suicide Squad Kills the Justice League. Not so much of a deep technical creative dive into it, but there will be some of that, but more about how our audio team ethos and pillars shaped our approach and what opportunities and what challenges these presented. So first, a bit about how our team is structured. So at the height of production, we had two audio directors, one looking mainly at music, one at sound effects, and dialogue split between us both. Then we have 5 sound designers from mid to principal level. Each sound designer at Rocksteady oversees a number of large elements of the sound design. For example, one of Leo's responsibilities is all of the environmental sounds, and one of Agatha's was the RPG systems. We try to keep a broad range of responsibilities on each sound designer, because we find that really helps with skills growth, avoid them becoming too frustrated, too niched, and helps at the end when we try to close out the project, because everyone can switch around and help each other out a bit more. We have a dialogue sound designer. They're responsible for ensuring all of the dialogue recordings sound amazing and the playback behaviors set up in Wise, along with all of the amazing dialogue effects. We have a music sound designer who is responsible for the music system design, working with external composers, recording session prep, lots and lots of stuff. We also have an incredible audio code team, the 4 audio programmers. They take care of crafting a lot of our bespoke audio systems, making sure Wise is nicely integrated, and helping us out with all of the technical aspects. Alongside the internal audio team, we also work really closely with an external composer, who I think is here, Rupert, somewhere, and an external sound design company, and a bunch of sound designers from other Weeby studios. So now let's dive a bit more into how we set about figuring out how we were going to work on Suicide Squad. So very early on in the project's concept phase, we decided that we needed to define a strong and explicit audio team ethos. And this was what we came up with, quite a few things, and we'll keep flipping back to this slide. So this was something we hadn't really done on Arkham Knight or VR, as the lore and the aesthetic and the team was already so well established. But with the new IP of Suicide Squad, the new genre and a new team before us, we decided we needed to adopt a different approach. So we decided we set out a departmental ethos, which is agnostic to the actual project. So that began to represent the ideological blueprint for how we wanted to work. So the ethos, the idea of those is that they constrain us and they begin to define a direction, but without prescribing any particular method. So they define the team culture and the set of behaviors, which we hope will work in synergy with the overall project pillars. Now, obviously, for us, it's key that they're easily understandable and achievable, and that was how that was our hope. I'm sure if that worked. So when I look at all of these and I distill them into the overriding spirit of what we're trying to do, we're trying to create something fresh. We're trying to push the boundaries of what we've done before and craft something unique and immersive for our players. And perhaps no ethos here is more relevant than recording everything. So we really wanted to produce a AAA game where every single piece of audio has been recorded by our team. So there's no commercial libraries. There are over 400,000 sound effects in the game. So obviously that's a lot to record. And that presented us with a quite massive, daunting, but exciting challenge. So to achieve that, we carried out hundreds of recording sessions in locations across the world. We spent weeks in Finland with a Foley artist, Heikki Kossi, capturing creaks and mechanisms and movements and lots and lots and lots and lots of footsteps. We recorded guns and explosions in the deserts of Arizona and California and got a deep understanding of the perils of tick bites. We zapped each other inside Faraday cages. We froze stuff, we burnt stuff, we microwaved things, all in the pursuit of perfect source material. Our sound designers even built a drop rig that we could send out for months at a time to remote locations. So from a crow sanctuary on the Isle of Wight, where we had the joy of recording a blind jackdaw named Malcolm, to the top of a mountain in New Mexico to record thunder. We constantly had to innovate on our recording processes. So this all sounds really fun, and it was, but as is with the case with all of these ethos, they also present us challenges. So what are some of the challenges of recording everything? Well, there's a lot of planning required to record this much audio. It's a lot of scouting locations, cold calling people, booking Foley artists, and so on. Another challenge is you have to schedule it. We can't just wait for everything to be finalized in the game before we start recording. That would just put us too far behind. But then that causes the risk that if we go too early, those recordings could become redundant aesthetically for their intended use. So we had to consider these when we were scheduling. But we did also know there was lots of source that we'd need, regardless of what the game was. So we did need to build a base general library of things like whooshes, electricity, and fire, so we could get recording those things straight away. But there was a time before we recorded any of those sounds, and we did have to get on with the prototyping and concepting. So we did have to use commercial libraries for that. So in order to keep track of this, our marvelous audio code team added a tick box to the WISE WAV import step that could identify whether or not it was a Rocksteady recorded sound effect. So we could run a script at a later point, and we could see what sounds we needed to replace, which was super helpful. So another challenge in recording everything is it's not the typical workflow for sound designers. So how to hire and onboard new team members. So Leo, you're going to talk a little bit about how it was for you when you started.
Yes. So as you can imagine, working in this new way, it was incredibly daunting. Where the hell had my sound libraries gone? And all this content I was used to using. Not only that, but I thought it would only be a matter of time before he realized that I knew close to nothing about field recording. However, it quickly became clear to me that what we look for at Rocksteady isn't necessarily a set of skills, but an attitude, right? I could go on and on about my learnings, but really the most important takeaway is that while all of these ethos, especially recording everything, can feel quite constraining, I found that over time it began to shape my sound design practice. I think much more carefully about the source content I need now in order to best support the narrative. And I can now clearly see how the decisions we make in the field while recording those sounds will end up impacting my sound design later down the line. Back to you, Andy.
Thanks, Leo. So there are a few of the challenges of using these ethos, and that neatly segues into another massive challenge. So Suicide Squad has an enormous and complex RPG system for which Agatha was the sound designer and is going to talk a little bit about her approach there.
Absolutely. But in order to discuss the RPG audio, I would like to highlight a few areas that have both helped and challenged our approach in designing it. Those are record everything, which you're going to hear a lot about today, avoiding audio cliches, responding positively to feedback, and tackling limitations in an honest and direct way. But let's start with what is RPG in Suicide Squad. Well, RPG themes in Suicide Squad consist of a variety of buffs and augments that diversify the combat and create a unique gameplay experience. In a game scenario, this could read as an augment activates at combo 5 times and higher and causes successful counters increase the damage of your next melee by 25%. All RPG themes can either trigger on the local player or remote players or enemies. They can be bespoke or systemic. Bespoke RPG themes can be themed around playable characters or villains, and systemic or generic buffs used across all characters or enemies. But they should all reinforce the combat, and whilst doing so, they teach the players the RPG language, enhance character's playstyle, and fully immerse the player into the RPG theme. So let's hear various RPG themes in action. In the video, we showcased a myriad of different RPG themes that can be broken down in the following way. The red background represents bespoke SFX, whilst the yellow is systemic. Each RPG theme consists of multiple activation items, and each item has a unique trigger SFX. The order from 1 to 5 represents the priority, that is, how important is particular sound effects to the player. For the purpose of this talk, we'll be focusing on bespoke SFX as they highlight how our audio ethos was applied to the complexity of the RPG themes. To give a bit of an overview of different bespoke RPG themes, let's start with the most important, character talents. So character talents are augments that are unique to each playable character and are designed to emphasize character's playstyle through buffing, gunplay, melee, and traversal. The second most important are gear sets that are villain-themed and designed to make players feel like they have a particular villain fighting alongside them. Thirdly, we have notorious items that are also designed around various villains and affect different hero assets such as weapons, grenades, or melee. The fourth and final set of bespoke RPG themes are villain synergies. They're villain-themed, well, as the name suggests, and the role is to alter combat when triggered. One in-game example could read as, every 20 critical hits, your weapon instantly reloads and you gain 100% increased critical hit damage for 20 seconds. And it's quite a mouthful to say it all at once. With all different types of bespoke RPG themes broken down, let's focus on audio design brief for them. All RPG activation SFX have unique and clear audio, are identifiable with eyes closed, feel amazing when triggered, are dialed up to 11, yes, we want them really loud, and always push either characters or villains' playstyle. With the brief at hand, we could narrow down some of the sound design challenges we've had. Those were all RPG SFX had to trigger instantly and be very short. So the main recognizable part of the sound had to happen within the first second. Otherwise, by the time the player would hear the full buff audio, they would have moved on to another objective. When the activation SFX is triggered, it had to cut through the mix and be flexible enough to work in all combat scenarios. Some of the activations would trigger on the player, whereas other could trigger on the enemies or affect grenades or melee. Therefore, one of the key considerations was to have SFX that could be easily layered over multiple sounds. One of the more difficult challenges was that the SFX of all RPG themes could stack up and quickly retrigger one after another based on the design condition. We could already hear some examples in the video I played at the beginning. To support this, we really had to look closely at the constant repetition of activation SFX and figure out how to design a cohesive experience with all of them triggering pretty much at once. Another challenge was rather interesting. Oftentimes, we would start only with the name of the RPG theme. To give an example, one of Harley's character talents was Arkham Special. That's all we had. We had no VFX, no timing, and no tying into the world. Basically, audio led the way, and the design expectation was to interpret the name of the augment. In order to lean into the name, we spent a lot of time discussing meaning behind each theme, because what does Bullseye or Brilliant sound like? How can we creatively represent them with audio so the buff can be immediately recognizable? In some cases, it was rather straightforward. For instance, Harley's character talents gave us a plethora of ideas due to her distinct sonic identity. However, the more we were leaning into the name of each augment, the more of a challenge it became. After a few failed attempts to meet the design brief, we started to realize that perhaps this area of the game wasn't about the innovation or designing outside of the box. With an initial reluctance, we asked ourselves, what if we embrace instead of avoid cliches? And this was a clear departure from our audio ethos that has kept us on track to deliver a cohesive sonic experience. After all, our main goal was to interpret the name in a way that the player could easily learn when a certain RPG theme triggers. So we started playing an association game. At times, it was very obvious and on the nose. As an example, Boomerang's talent was called Jackpot. We were trying to design something that sounds similar to a one-arm bandit machine, whilst still incorporating Boomerang's sound identity. And here's the result. Deathshot's augment's name was Grim Reaper, so we were leaning into something dark and moody yet obvious, such as opening of a grave with a background church bells and crows. As much of a departure from our ethos as it was, embracing cliches allowed us to emphasize the correlation between the name and the sound, while still focusing on villainous or character-specific flavors of the RPG themes. Okay, so we had the formula, we were meeting the design brief, everything was running smoothly. But as it often happens, eventually the constantly increasing amount of the augment names started to have a synonymous meaning to us, with the villain's power sounding all too similar. So in that moment, we look towards our other ethos. We record everything. To give ourselves a good framework to distinguish similar themes, we created artificial constraints. And these constraints define the types of the content we would pull from. They helped us decide what the sound should and should not be. One example of those constraints is how we created a sonic difference between Bane's Venom, Scarecrow's Fear Toxin, and Dr. Poison's Poison. All three villains have some version of poison as their power, but one of our goals was to make each activation sound unique. And here's how we have distinguished the sound of poison for all three villains. One of the very first villains we tackled was Bane. We decided that the sound of Venom should have an injection impact, highly pressurized liquid, elements of gore, layer of animalistic vocalization to emphasize Venom effect on the body, not have any compressed air elements, nor any obvious bubbles. And here's the result. For Scarecrow's Fear Toxin, we looked back at his previous sound design, along with how we have defined Venom. Therefore, the final brief was compressed air for the gaseous effect, gaseous sounds with an element of vocalization. The very noisy shower head was of classic use here. Crow's calls or wing flaps. Bubbles should not be the base of the sound, and definitely no gore. When Dr. Poison was designed, we already had defined Bane's Venom and Scarecrow's Fear Toxin. Therefore, it was much easier to seek the combination that has not yet existed in-game. As a result, Dr. Poison's constraints were bubbles as the base of the sound, a liquid layer, nothing gaseous, and certainly no gore. With all of the RPG themes mapped out, cliches embraced, and constraints defined, the next step was to obviously look at the mix. However, before we talk about that, let's dive deeper into what our audio ethos had in designing weather in Suicide Squad. Leo?
Yes. I mean, since we're in the UK, let's talk about the weather. I've been waiting for that one. Yeah, so as Andy mentioned, when I first joined Rocksteady, I was tasked with looking at the environmental effects, and weather was a big thing. And obviously, knowing that weather had greatly defined our games in the past, I thought we might as well look back. So I didn't work on the Arkham games, but I think it's important to talk about them. So keeping with the general theme of our talk, our pillars and ethos played a big role in dictating the way we work. So when we look at a game like Arkham Knight, you're probably imagining a scene much like the one you see up here. It might be a bit difficult to see, but what you can see. Our lonely hero overlooking the Gothic skyline of Gotham on a stormy and rainy night. There were two main considerations that played a key role in influencing our approach to the weather in the Arkham games. So first, the rainy weather was not only an integral part of the audiovisual aesthetic, but it also reinforced an important narrative pillar of the game, which is to be the Batman. That is because in many ways, Bruce Wayne's internal mood is reflected in the diegesis of the game. I'm sure some of you have heard of the concept of Michel Chion's concept of empathetic sounds, where sound effects and music reflect the mood of a scene, and that's very much the case here. The second consideration is that it's also important to note that gameplay supported moments where we could really showcase the weather. For example, in moments where we were skulking around alleys and rooftops, we could push player immersion by highlighting the environmental SFX. So given these two narrative and gameplay considerations, a lot of time was poured into designing the playback system for these sounds. So to put it simply, a series of downward raycasts were used to check surface materials and exposure to the sky around the player. This allowed us to play back surface accurate and highly positional rain SFX around the listener. This was all done at runtime, and of course it was very computationally expensive. However, we could eat that cost because the project's needs demanded such an approach. Keep that in mind as we move forward. Now, meanwhile, in Metropolis, this looks like outside today, which is quite rare for the UK. We've got sunlit mornings. We've got stormy evenings. We've seen that before in Rocksteady games, and everything in between, including dust storms. So how do we approach the project requirements for Suicide Squad, and how do they shape the way we looked at the sound design for the weather? So first off, this is Rocksteady's first to feature a fully dynamic weather and day and night cycle. Secondly, the gameplay is frantic, so the weather is rarely at the forefront of the experience. But I think there's a key consideration there is that, Brainiac, the big baddie in the sky, can control the weather as well. So there are moments in the narrative where it is important. So I've got two main problems to solve. We've got plenty of rain recordings from the Arkham games. We've got tons of that in our libraries. But we need a lot more source content to take care of all the other different weather states. We also need a playback system that supports dynamic weather and time of day changes. So as I talk about the recording implementation of our weather SFX, I want you to just quickly reflect on some of our departmental ethos once again. The ones I'd like to particularly highlight are, well, as we haven't said, we record everything. We know when and where to innovate. This is really reflected in the last slide. Innovation always needs to be in service of the project's needs. We spend time discussing ideas together. That's important, and more on that later. And we learn new things and learn from failure. Now, that seems like a redundant question. How does one go about recording the weather? Well, you might have some ideas, and they might be confirmed by the next few slides. So in order to record the weather, one must climb mountains, lugging around 20 kilograms of microphones and recording equipment. That was up in the Lake District. In order to record the weather, one must clamber around seaweed-infested rocks, avoiding dropping expensive mics into the sea. The 70 mustache is not a requirement. In order to record the weather, one must reconnect with nature and return said expensive mics to the sea. Maybe we're meant to leave this one out. There's someone in this room that has an orange jacket. I'm not going to name any names. In order to record the weather, one must learn how to engage with really dark and mysterious forces, such as Kima. Sometimes we really had to think outside of the box. So we had plenty of recordings of rain on objects from the Arkham games, but could we generate assets in a new way? So one of our colleagues was really passionate about synthesizing sounds in Kima. And one day we were speaking, as we often did, about rain impacts on objects. And he asked me a very weird and silly question. What actually is a rain impact? There I was, being quite puzzled. And when he had enough of the puzzled look on my face, he said, well, think of it as an impulse response. The raindrop is the impulse, the object produces the response. So that gave me tons of ideas, and I started trawling through all the recordings of impacts that we had from our physics system in the game, and built impulse responses from all those different impacts. And then we built a patch in Kima that could randomly play short bursts of white noise through those impulse responses, and we've got stuff like this, which in isolation sounds terrible. But in the context of a rainy scene and all the different objects in the city, it worked pretty well. Some sounds deceived us for many, many years. And no, it's not the sound of big purple glowing eyes. We couldn't record that. It is thunder, actually. And this is what I like to talk about, the 3 unavoidable realities of field recording. First one, be prepared to become an expert in an area every 2 weeks, perhaps every week. Field recording is a risky business. It's time-consuming, it's expensive. So we look at it always from the approach of how can we minimize risk so that we can get the best possible source content. And when it comes to recording the thunder, we thought, well, let's do a lot of research into thunder. And we found out, hey, there are a few folks that have done more research than us. There's a thunder research laboratory in New Mexico. And they're located in this remote mountain, which had the perfect conditions for regular, isolated, and stationary thunderstorms. We're winning, huh? So in 2022, we put together one of our drop rigs, sent it out to them, really, really excited. And of course, that was the one summer where they had few and weak thunderstorms. So the second reality, be prepared to fail. It's gonna happen a lot. Have a plan B, C, D, maybe all the way up to Z. So for us, we made sure that everybody in the team had a recording setup at home. People had microphones. And when thunderstorms happen in London, which were very rare, maybe we got 2 or 3 during the span of development, we sent a message out. Everyone would run outside in the rain with their microphones and their recording equipment. And we actually did manage to get some content that way, but not enough. So there we were, looking up at the sky and thinking, dear God, give us more thunder, and thinking, what do we do? And then these deep and intrusive thoughts start coming in. Just get a sound library. Just buy a library. They sound great. There's plenty of them for thunder. But remember, there's nothing wrong with using sound libraries, but we had that ethos that was driving us. So we said, let's go again. So in 2023, I kept saying 2003 in this slide. 2023, we thought, let's try again. Many fingers were crossed, and we put together the second iteration of our drop rig. You will not want to be stopped by the Metropolitan Police on the tube carrying this. It looks a bit dangerous. And we put this together and shipped it off to New Mexico, and they laid it out on a beautiful mountaintop. This is literally a picture of where they put it. And when we got the SD cards back, this is what we heard. Not bad. Not bad at all. So the great thing about having this in a perfectly remote place is that we recorded loads of other things as well. Crickets, birds, dog barks, train horns, and even some distant gunshots. Remember, this is in the backwoods of the US, so unfortunately, no guarantees no one was harmed in the making of this game. We might have recorded the murder, we just don't know. So remember, I said there were 3 realities. I only pointed out 2. If you caught on to that, good job, brownie points. Well, the third one is be prepared to succeed, because you will, and when you least expect it. Great. We've got loads of new sounds. How do we play them back? So yet again, in terms of communicating with colleagues, I was speaking to 2 of my coworkers, and they were working on a system to gather data about the geometry around the player, all at real time. This would be used to algorithmically select exterior reverbs and to trigger reflection taps from the buildings and geometry around the listener. The system used assigned distance fields, SDFs. We can talk more about them later. They can get a bit complicated, but they're essentially a way, a method of scene representation. So it's about gathering a distance to mesh surface data. This data is generated offline and cached, making it cheaper than using traditional raycasts to detect collision at runtime. Here's just a quick look at some of our debug for this data being gathered in real time. So you can see the horizontal casts are gathering data about the geometry around the player on the horizontal plane, and those little dots on the ground, those are the vertical casts that are catching all sorts of information about exposure to the sky, what sort of type of surface material, etc. So in our audio playback system, wind and precipitation content is played as mono files in the standard quad configuration. And the reason why we play it back as mono is because as the player moves the camera around, each one of these quadrants is querying the data gathered from the surface and reflection casts in order to determine how much and what type of wind and precipitation content to play from each speaker position. Now I could stick a picture of how it's set up in Wise, but I think this kind of captures it a little bit better, or not. It might be more confusing. There's a lot of arrows and names and letters. It confuses me. So we have essentially one global weather event that triggers all the weather SFX. So you can see we split up into generally wind and precipitation. Then we have each quadrant, all the 4 quadrants for each one of them. And for the wind, so let's say take the left quadrant, we have 3 layers. So we have a base layer that's general wind gusts, primarily driven by the amplitude of the wind. Those parameters gathered from the weather system. Then we have an altitude layer, which is wispy, high-pitched wind, which is, of course, affected by altitude, but also about how much geometry is around the player. We know when the player is at a high altitude and there's little to no geometry, we can take a pretty good guess they're on a rooftop. So we play this kind of wispy wind. And the opposite, a tonal layer. So we have this low howling wind triggered in tight spaces when there's a lot of geometry present. So when we know lots of geometry, low to the ground, you're probably in an alleyway. So here is a quick little demo of how this all works in real time. Little nighttime scene. We've got some crickets that were recorded in New Mexico. Lovely. Transition to daytime. Now we have some more daytime singing crickets. Now we're going to transition to a rainy weather state. And then as we move the camera forward here, you hear some of those lovely little impact sounds we've synthesized in Keynote. Now we're going to transition to a dry dust storm weather state. And we're going to move now to a really tight space, and you can hear that tonal layer really coming in as you move inside. Now we transition to stormy. So you're going to hear some of those thunder strikes. First, really low pass, because we can also get the information about tight space. You're probably in the interior sort of area. We can low pass the thunder. And as you move outside, you hear all the weather comes up again. Sound of the trees driven by a meter on the wind. A lot clearer thunder strikes. And as you move up and there's less geometry on the listener, everything kind of gets pushed up to 11. Wispy wind comes in, the wind is louder, the rain is louder, the thunder is louder. That is the weather of UK. All right, back to you, Andy. How do we bring it all together?
Thanks. So the mix, this is where we bring it all together. So this is the moment we refine all of the years of work that we poured into all of these individual features, and we smash it all together and hopefully make it into this nice, coherent experience. So as always, we had a fairly good sense of how we would proceed, that we would later totally abandon. But the plan was, well, first of all, each of the sound designers would pre-mix their individual features and make sure any bespoke mixing tech was implemented and working, so that then we could move on to the final mix. So, Leo, that's back to you. I haven't had enough of it yet.
If you've missed me, I'm back. So, how do we mix the weather? Well, I can talk about the traditional ways in which we would mix backgrounds, but I won't. So I'm going to talk about some of the bespoke tech we had. And one of them was mix tags. So mix tags is all about culling sounds at their earliest possible instance. So we use this to suppress the playback of events based on their name. It's really, really useful. And it really helps us to declutter the mix. Just sounds that are not important at specific moments of the game, we can just get rid of them, which is great. All that work I spent, recording all that stuff, we can eject it. So events are suppressed before they reach Ys, which is great in terms of optimization, because then we decrease the number of actual active and virtual voices. And the strict naming was key here. Naming convention was key, because then we could get rid of sounds based on a shared prefix, and we can be really surgical with it. So all the weather, for example, started with a shared wet prefix, ambiances, amp, so on and so forth, but we could get even further than that. So just a general example of how this works in the context of the combat intensity levels. So as you get into more and more intense combat in the game, we can start getting rid of stuff. So anything that has a PSO prefix, so that's point sources, so the ambient emitters around the road, we start calling them at combat level 2. Maybe you're fighting 2 or 3 enemies. And as that gets more intense, we get rid of them bespoke ambiances. From combat level 4 onwards, music's blaring, there's all this stuff happening in the mix. We actually just completely cull all weather SFX. You cannot hear it in-game at all. But then you say, well, what happens if you mute the music? Well, we started getting all sorts of bugs. QA was testing out the games in all sorts of different scenarios. They would mute the music, they would get into combat, and they say, it feels a bit weird, it feels a bit dead, like you kind of like go into silence in between gunshots and explosions. Well, we said, well, we can fix that with our mix tags as well. So we could easily find out if the player had muted the music, and then we could say, well, let's keep some of those layers around, and we could be very surgical. So then we could get rid of maybe the tonal and the altitude layer, but the actual base layer could be kept on at all times for the wind, and vice versa for the precipitation as well. So you never really go into silence in the mix. So this was our general approach to mixing sounds in the background. How do we approach something that's a lot more in the foreground?
It was very much the forefront of it, and we were seeking clarity in the mix. The main question we kept asking ourselves was, what is the most important sound to the player in this particular moment? And in a busy combat scenario, this wasn't always the easiest question to answer. So one of our solutions was to set up an RPG-specific priority system in Wise. We kept updating it throughout the whole development based on the feedback. The priority system carves out space in the music, combat, and gameplay SFX, but also, very importantly, ducks other less important RPG SFX if they were to trigger simultaneously. So if you look at the slide, if gear set and villain synergy SFX were to trigger at the same time, villain synergy wouldn't be audible due to its lower priority. Further, we were seeking a solution for the RPG SFX having the ability to instantly retrigger, stack up, or play over one another. As the first video of the RPG section showcased, in Suicide Squad, various themes could trigger in a short sequence. And this light has character talent, villain synergy, and notorious item activating on the player. Additionally, there are lots of other active augments SFX attempting to trigger, and this can be seen to the left of the screen. However, so the first step was to basically limit instances in Wise, but that obviously wasn't enough, as the augments could stack up and retrigger a few seconds apart. So for that, our approach was to add the ability to define a cooldown in the trigger logic, and also add the condition to not allow audio to trigger when stacking. This was very much a case-by-case process that had to be constantly reviewed against other RPG SFX to maintain a cohesive combat experience. And now that we've looked at those two features individually, how did we bring it all together, Andy?
Thank you. Well, remember, we had a plan. And that's the first step of the plan, is we've mixed all of these independent features. And now we move on to, well, we're going to have a dedicated post-production period, right? We're going to play through the game linearly. We mix all of these interdependent systems into a cohesive whole. But of course, it never quite works out like that. So I'm just going to talk about a few of the challenges and how we address those. So Suicide Squad is not a typical linear narrative game, which meant that linear approach didn't work. Suicide Squad is a very complex multiplayer cooperative online shooter, so was still quite bug-rich during our dedicated post-production period. So we found when we would try and mix a section of the game, we would get pulled in a lot of different directions. We'd set off trying to mix the sounds of Deadshot's jetpack, but all the footsteps would play the wrong impacts. It was very overwhelming, and we simply weren't, or didn't feel like we were making any progress. We were lost. But remember, we go back to our culture and we care for our team and our responsibilities. We spend time together discussing ideas and show passion and determination. So we took a moment to pause and reflect and reimagine our approach. We ended up breaking the game down more into features that would become our mix focus for each session, and devised a system of just logging bugs and other notes to avoid distraction. So any bugs we would find, we would just ignore them. We just stick to that at one focus. So that enabled us to be quite disciplined, and it also enabled us to measure better our progression through this enormous task of mixing this whole game. So I think, again, it's a demonstration of how our team culture allowed us to move forwards and guided us to reappraise how we were working. So secondly, the game is quite a systemic game. So this approach meant that we had a lot of interconnected features within a much larger complex system. And so, like the butterfly flapping its wings in chaos theory, a tiny little fader move somewhere on the dialogue may have just a disastrous ramification elsewhere. But we tackled these limitations, and we just came up with what we thought was a really simple and elegant little solution. So we just devised a small suite of reference missions. We'd always play through those missions at the start and end of each mix session, which also actually really helped to calibrate our ears again every morning when we set off on a new feature, and was a great way to maintain our mix confidence. So we also discovered we had created some unintended blind spots. So early on in development, we created these tools in Unreal to help us make content with maximum efficiency and speed. And that meant a lot of audio data, like volume and delay and so on, was not actually represented in WISE at all. So on reflection, we kind of think maybe that was a failure of knowing when and where to innovate. Like, it did really help us during development, but I think we've learned that we need to consider the approach across the whole of the game, across all of the different phases, so we can be more proactive and not just reactive. So this is really a learning for future projects. Finally, we're mixing for the players, and they have a diverse set of client conditions. So we figured a lot of people, you know, they're going to be playing on headphones. So how are we going to do that? And we really wanted to create a really amazing 3D immersive mix as well. So we'd have just an octopus of cables in the mix room. We'd be all tangled up in this, going into a headphone amp, then going into the PS5 controller. But, you know, we strive to please our audience, and it's not always easy. So that was just another challenge along the way. But I think at every stage, all of these ethos were really helpful to us. And here they are again. Every single one of these proved instrumental in helping us achieve what I would think that is a quite remarkable sound in Suicide Squad. I don't think we would have survived the length of development without such a strong ethos and culture driving us forwards, constraining us and guiding us. And I'm just going to finish off with the theft of an excellent quote from Stravinsky, which is, "My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action, and the more I surround myself with obstacles. Whatever diminishes constraint diminishes strength. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit." Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you very much. We have run really tight on time. So what I'll say is we're going to go straight into the panel, but I'm sure these guys will be around if any of you have any questions after the panel. Brilliant. Thank you very much. So could I ask all the panelists to take a seat? There are also some beers that have arrived, so if you want to quickly grab one. These have been sponsored by Audio.